Hello everybody, Basil here and welcome to this special episode on the Spanish Civil War. Ever since completing the chronological video series on the Civil War, where I discuss the events that occurred, there have been several questions which I have had burning in my mind that I wasn't exactly able to answer then. It is for this reason why I plan to make a special video series asking a series of questions about the aspects of the war which aren't initially obvious. Without further ado, let's begin with the first inquiry. Now, if you have watched my other video series, you will know that the Republicans didn't exactly have many moments of glory, repeatedly losing battle after battle to the Nationalists in a string of humiliations. In fact, it is safe to say that they didn't win a single offensive victory, only having wins when their opponent made reckless attacks which any force could have dealt with, such as in the battles of Levante or Guadalajara. This is despite having control over considerably more land and population at the beginning of the war, which makes this a rather peculiar defeat. Now, this conundrum has many answers, and it's difficult to really point out the most major reason as to why the Republic suffered these losses. I would also like to point out that the Republican Army was by no means a monolith, as it had many different fighting groups who all had their own individual faults, which means that while some flaws, which I will be pointing out today, may have been present in most of their ranks, there were many exceptions to the rule. Additionally, I would also like to mention that the Nationalists, for all of their winnings, weren't exactly great at fighting either. Many of the problems associated with the Republican Army that I will be discussing were also present amongst the Nationalists, just to a much lesser extent, which is why I will be examining the Nationalist fighting force and giving a comparison alongside. Nevertheless, I hope to give you a clear picture by giving the most glaring issues and putting them head to head with the adversary. Now, let's start by covering the quality of the troops and the minds that led them. There is simply no doubt that this is a field that the Republicans were utterly hopeless in. They would mainly rely on a combination of worker militias, volunteers from the countryside, which were usually peasants who could or could not have been illiterate, or foreign volunteers who in many cases could not even speak Spanish. These people may have been committed and loyal to the cause, but their fighting ability was almost non-existent, as they had no experience in combat and would receive as little as a single week of training before being sent off to the front lines. Not to mention, the little training which they did receive was hardly going to help, since there were no experienced fighters to pass on their knowledge. George Orwell, in his book Homage to Catalonia, which is a great read and I strongly recommend it, mentions that the new recruits were only taught how to march in the direction they were ordered, and that was about it. Nothing about how to find cover, use weapons, or move around on the battlefield. Discipline and coordination were severely lacking, especially in the communist and anarchist militias. They were ideologically opposed to the concept of hierarchy and organization, especially when fighting, because that would just make them resemble the army, which they believed was a tool of the state and therefore evil. Instead, their members were notorious for doing things like leaving to have a break on the home front without any notice or skipping sentry duty. Now, many of these fighters were certainly brave and committed to the cause. The international brigades especially earned the reputation of having near suicidal levels of bravery in battle. However, this only increased their casualty rates, as there were many occasions where they recklessly charged straight into machine gun fire, believing that courage and daring alone could win a fight. Now, when it came to their commanders, not much talent could really be found. This is mainly because almost the entire previous army of Spain had defected to the Nationalists, which meant that all of the military expertise that would help was on the enemy side. In order to fill the void, the Republic had to rely on the Soviets for wisdom, who were mostly mediocre. There is also no mentioning of the fact that many of the Republican generals were incapable of working together, as they all supported different factions that had their own personal interests, which led to much suspicion between them. The Nationalists, on the other hand, had far better luck. They could rely both on the generals and the Army of Africa, which had gained a lot of experience from Morocco during the Rif War. Now, the Rift War itself was an interesting topic which I could do a video on in the future, but to summarize, it was essentially a rebellion by the Riffian tribes under Spanish control in the early 1920s. It was brutal, and the paramilitary wing which the Spanish army employed learned many a valuable lesson on how to fight and terrorize their way to victory. Since Spain's generals, including Franco, had fought in the conflict, it meant that despite the nationalists having to recruit soldiers from similar stock as the Republicans, those recruits would receive far more adequate training. They would learn how to perform drills, work cooperatively, and how to correctly use weapons. On top of this, there was the issue of equipment and weapons. Now, to be fair, both sides suffered greatly from inadequate weaponry, especially in the beginning of the war, as Spanish industry was simply not used to making modern war gear, which meant that the stuff at hand was woefully outdated. However, the crucial part is that the nationalists were able to solve this problem, whilst the Republicans did not. First of all, Franco was able to secure much better funding and material from abroad, that being weapons from Germany and Italy, as well as trucks and oil from American companies. The latter would prove to be crucial, as logistics are a typically unappreciated aspect in warfare. In fact, several battles were won simply because they could get their forces to the site quicker than the Republicans could, such as in the response to the attack on Brunette. He also got a really good air force from Hitler in the form of the Condor Legion, which was composed of Heinkel 111s and Junker 52 planes, which would prove to be an excellent support for the flunkies on the ground. It goes without saying that the fascist countries were extremely generous, since Hitler knew that this would be a perfect opportunity to test out many of the new weapons that his industry had been developing for the upcoming wars of conquest he was to embark on. Now make no mistake, the nationalists would still have to use guns that were in some cases 20 years old, but this was more than made up for. Meanwhile, because the English and the French had chosen not to intervene, the Republicans had to turn to the Soviet Union, which was a far less generous donor. To begin with, there was the fact that Stalin was far more apathetic to the situation than Germany and Italy were, so he mainly saw it as an opportunity to swindle the Spanish Republic. The Republicans were forced to make very unfair deals, such as selling all of their gold reserves to obtain the tools they needed. What they received from these deals was hardly sufficient. In terms of armored vehicles, the Republicans replied primarily with the T-26 tank, a Russian design that regularly broke down and which generally was terrible at combat. The field guns and rifles which they got were in many cases obsolete, some of them dating back to the years of the Tsars. The aircraft they used was also at best mediocre and completely outclassed, which was compounded by the fact that the men who piloted them were inexperienced, while the nationalist pilots were trained professionals of the Third Reich. This shortage of military equipment meant that the Republican militias had to scavenge for whatever makeshift weapons they could find. This created complications, since the diversity of old, rusty rifles they used required all different kinds of ammunition, which they would have to painstakingly sort through. Utility weapons such as grenades had to be improvised, such as filling tomato cans with dynamite sticks. In addition, there were the crippling domestic issues at the home front in the Republican zone. Now, this is not exactly a tactical issue, but it is still an important one nonetheless, as a healthy society with a functioning economy and a happy population is going to have an easier time fighting a war than one which isn't. To begin with, the economic apparatus was always poor. When the leftist militias were able to take over, they instituted many radical reforms such as land and wealth redistribution, commandeering hotels and private houses, and introducing collective farms in some areas, which became very inefficient. These decisions, along with the shock of war, made many foreign investors flee, and, as it tends to go with socialist states, the economy implodes. Food shortages were a constant issue, with both affected civilians and the army. The Republican zone would see hyperinflation later on in the war due to crappy monetary policies by Juan Negrin, leader of the Republicans. This lack in material wealth would compound another issue, which some have said was the biggest blight facing the Republic, that being political unity. It was close to impossible to get every ideology and faction within the Republicans, whether they be the anarchists, the liberals, or the socialists, or the communists, to live harmoniously, let alone to cooperate with one another. The underlying reason for this is that these ideologies had wildly varying beliefs on how society should look, with liberals aspiring for a free market democracy, communists embracing Marxist-Leninist statism, and anarchists wishing to abolish the state entirely. It's a problem that has plagued almost every revolution, and that's the disagreement as to what should come after it has succeeded. There is also not to mention that there would even be conservative factions in the Republican zone, such as the Basque nationalists, who had only joined because they wished to separate from Spain. Now, it would be a fallacy to say that the nationalists were themselves completely unified, especially in the beginning of the war. There were major disagreements between different parties such as the Carlists and the Phalangists as to what to do with the monarchy or the economic policy, but these conflicts never really inflamed. There was an attempted coup by some disgruntled Phalangists at one point, but the nationalist factions were eventually able to settle aside their differences and accept Franco as their leader, albeit after a little bit of strong-arming on his part. Nationalist disunity would become irrelevant once they began winning the war and morale was high. In addition, the nationalist zone was better off materially, not suffering from inflation or food insecurity. The spirits of the people were high and rallied around the cause of purging the nation of radical elements, and the rulers even invoked the spirit of the Spanish Reconquista. Meanwhile, the Republicans had to deal with several uprisings and constant bickering and disagreement amongst the leadership. This was most pronounced during the May Days, when the Republican government had to put down an anarchist rebellion in Barcelona, which almost created a civil war within a civil war. Many segments of the Republic's population were displeased and cynical as to whether their government really had their interests at heart and was controlled by communist sympathizers. In order to increase support, Juan Negrin decided to suppress elements of dissent using the NKVD sent by Stalin, which probably only exacerbated the issue. However, one sure way to get a good backing from the people is to defeat the enemy, which is why Juan wanted to prioritize winning the war. Which leads me to my final point, and that is that the overall Republican strategy sucked. Now, the biggest battles of the Civil War, excluding Madrid, were the battles of Brunete, Teruel, and El Ebro. All of them were reckless Republican attacks which ended in failure, which is odd, because it's not usually the losing side that does most of the attacking in war. But it becomes understandable when you know what they were intending. Juan Negrin knew that the Republicans were a disunified, demoralized clusterfudge, and the best way to get them on his side was if he could win a major decisive victory. Such an event would rally the people behind him in a common cause, as it has usually done in countless wars throughout history. And yet, it was highly detrimental. Again and again, their troops threw themselves at the enemy, suffering massive casualties for almost nothing. Ironically, this only had the effect of further demoralizing the Republican population, making them less committed and still less obedient. Franco, meanwhile, was more pragmatic in the way he waged war. He was still prone to blunders, though, such as his obsession with Madrid, which cost him dearly. But he was willing to reorientate his strategy when he learned from his mistakes. When reviewing all of these factors, it is difficult for me to imagine the Republicans winning the Civil War. There are many things that would have to change if they were to have a chance at victory. Their skill in battle was legendarily poor, and they simply didn't have the hardware their enemies had. The funny thing, though, is that I'm of the opinion that the Nationalists were also terrible fighters. I mean, if faced with a legitimately good opponent, such as the Germans or the British, they would have crumbled in an instant. They were bad, just not as bad as their adversary. This has been Basil Jeffin, and I hope you liked this brief analysis.